October 15, 2019. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days in Millbrook, Oregon, and Clara Bennett stood at the window of her small cottage, watching the Douglas firs bend under the weight of the storm. Lightning split the sky over Cascade Ridge, illuminating the town below, a place that had once felt like home, but now felt like a courtroom where she was perpetually on trial. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, her reflection staring back at her with eyes that had learned to hide too much. 32 years old, unmarried and childless in a town where a woman's value was measured in baptisms and birthday parties. The arithmetic of her worth had been calculated and found wanting. The grocery store had been particularly brutal that morning. Clara had needed supplies before the storm worsened, but she'd made the mistake of going during the church crowd's shopping hour. Margaret Holloway, the pastor's wife, had been holding court near the produce section, her voice carrying with the practiced projection of someone who wanted to be overheard. "It's unnatural, is what it is," Margaret had announced to her circle of disciples, weighing tomatoes with the same judgmental precision she applied to people's lives. A woman her age alone, refusing every decent man who's shown interest. "My Robert says there's something wrong with her, something broken inside, that even the Lord can't fix." Clara had frozen behind the cereal display, her basket growing heavy in her hands. "They say she went to 3 different doctors in Portland," another voice chimed in. Linda Hutchinson, whose twin boys were the pride of Millbrook Elementary, spent a fortune trying to figure out why she couldn't. "You know, turns out some women just aren't meant to be mothers. It's nature's way of telling us something." The word had slithered through the aisles like poison. Barren. Clara had abandoned her shopping basket and walked out into the rain without her supplies, her chest tight with a pain that had become numbingly familiar. She'd driven home with tears blurring her vision, the windshield wipers beating a rhythm that sounded like the town's verdict. Defective, defective, defective. Now, hours later, she stood in her cottage trying to convince herself that their words didn't matter. But words had weight in small towns. They accumulated like snow, and eventually, the burden became too heavy to carry. Her cottage sat on the eastern edge of Millbrook, where the residential streets gave way to logging roads and wilderness. She'd bought it 5 years ago with money inherited from her grandmother, the only person who'd ever told her she was exactly as she was. The isolation had seemed peaceful then. Now it felt like exile. Clara turned from the window and surveyed her living room. Books lined every wall, her constant companions, her escape routes from a reality that had become increasingly suffocating. She'd built a life here. Her work as a freelance editor allowed her to avoid the daily judgment of an office. Her garden provided both beauty and purpose. And her rescue dog, Hemingway, offered unconditional love that asked nothing in return. But on nights like this, when the storm raged and the loneliness pressed in from all sides, she wondered if survival was the same thing as living. The medical diagnosis had come 3 years ago, delivered by Dr. Patricia Chun in a Portland clinic. With sympathy but clinical detachment, severe endometriosis, complicated by premature ovarian insufficiency. "Your chances of conceiving naturally are less than 2%, Dr. Chun had said, her eyes soft with professional compassion. "IVF might be an option, but given the severity of this scarring... double quotes, Clara had stopped listening. She'd walked out of that appointment and driven straight to the coast, where she'd sat on the rocks at Cannon Beach and watched the waves destroy themselves against the shore. Over and over, relentless and futile. She hadn't told anyone in Millbrook about the diagnosis. Why give them medical confirmation of what they'd already decided? The label they'd given her, Barren Curse, had started as cruel gossip, but had calcified into something worse. Accepted fact. The worst part wasn't the cruelty. Clara had developed calluses against outright meanness. The worst part was the pity. From people like her former friend, Sarah Kimball, who'd pulled her aside at the 4th of July picnic with tears in her eyes and said, "I just want you to know that even though you'll never experience the joy of motherhood, you can still have a meaningful life. You could volunteer with children, or maybe get a cat." Sarah had meant well, which somehow made it worse. The implication was clear. Clara's life would always be defined by what it lacked, not what it contained. Thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the cottage's foundation. Hemingway whined from his bed near the fireplace, his ears flat against his head. Clara went to him, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears. "Just a storm, buddy," she murmured. "It'll pass." But this storm felt different. The wind had an edge of violence she hadn't heard before, and the rain pounded the roof with almost personal malice. She checked her phone, no service. The cell tower on Hawk Mountain must have gone down. Clara built up the fire and settled into her reading chair with a cup of tea, trying to lose herself in a manuscript about Victorian architecture. But her mind kept drifting to the morning's encounter, to Margaret Holloway's voice dripping with righteous certainty, something broken inside that even the Lord can't fix. Was she broken? Clara had asked herself this question 1,000 times. Usually at 3 in the morning, when insomnia and doubt formed their cruelest alliance. She'd catalogued her failures with the thoroughness of a coroner. The engagement to Daniel Morrison that had ended when he'd admitted he wanted children more than he wanted her. The brief relationship with Kevin Torres, who'd suggested adoption with the enthusiasm of someone settling for a consolation prize. The series of first dates that never became second dates once men learned about her condition. Each rejection had reinforced the narrative. She was incomplete, a woman failing at the one thing women were supposedly designed to do. But there were moments, rare and precious, when Clara glimpsed a different truth. When she finished editing a manuscript and knew she'd helped bring someone's dream to life. When her garden bloomed in defiant color against the Oregon gray. When Hemingway pressed his head against her knee with perfect trust. In those moments, she felt whole. The problem was, those moments never lasted long enough to outweigh the crushing weight of Millbrook's judgment. A massive crack of lightning illuminated the cottage, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to split the sky open. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the firelight dancing on the walls. Clara fumbled for her phone, using its dim screen to navigate to the kitchen drawer where she kept emergency candles. She just lit the first one when Hemingway erupted in frantic barking, charging toward the front door with his hackles raised. Quiet. Clara called, but the dog ignored her, his barks taking on a note of genuine alarm. Then she heard it. 3 heavy knocks on her door, barely audible. Above the storm's roar, Clara's heart hammered. Nobody came out this far in good weather, let alone during what was rapidly becoming the worst storm Millbrook had seen in a decade. She approached the door cautiously, Hemingway positioned protectively between her and whoever stood outside. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. No answer. Just another 3 knocks, more insistent this time. Clara grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and, after a moment's hesitation, unlocked the door and pulled it open. The man on her porch was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the storm behind him. Was soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his skull, water streaming down a face that looked like it had been carved from the mountains themselves, all hard angles and weathered plains. His clothes were simple flannel shirt, worn jeans, heavy boots, but there was something in his eyes that stopped Clara's breath. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they held her gaze with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "My truck's in your ditch," he said, his voice a low rumble barely louder than the thunder. "Flash flood took out the road. I need shelter until the storm breaks." It wasn't a request so much as a statement of fact. delivered without apology or expectation. Hemingway had stopped barking and was now sitting at Clara's feet, his tail cautiously wagging. Every safety rule Clara had ever learned screamed at her to shut the door. Strange man, isolated location, no cell service. But something in his eyes, a kind of raw honesty she hadn't seen in years, made her step aside. "Come in," she heard herself say. "You'll freeze if you stay out there." The man entered, water pooling immediately on her floor. He was even larger inside the cottage, his presence filling the small space with a kind of quiet authority. He moved like someone accustomed to hardship, economical and purposeful. "I've got towels," Clara said, setting down the poker and trying to regain some sense of control. "And I can make coffee. The stove's gas, so it still works." "Obliged," he said, and began removing his boots with the careful consideration of someone entering a sacred space. Clara retrieved towels from the linen closet, her hands trembling slightly. When she returned, the man had moved to stand near the fire, his back to her, revealing a tattoo on his forearm that looked like a compass rose surrounded by mountains. "I'm Clara," she offered, holding out the towels. He turned, taking them with hands that were scarred and calloused, hands that had clearly known hard work. "Finn," he said. "Finn Crawford." "You're not from Millbrook," Clara observed. She knew everyone in town, at least by sight, and this man was decidedly not local. "No, ma'am. I live up on Phantom Ridge, about 15 miles north. I was heading into town for supplies when the road gave out." Phantom Ridge. Clara knew of it, a remote area high in the Cascades where a handful of people lived off the grid, avoiding civilization by choice rather than circumstance. People in Millbrook talked about the ridge dwellers with a mixture of suspicion and awe, as if they were a different species altogether. "That's a long way to come for groceries," Clara said, busying herself with making coffee. "Once a month, usually. I make do with what I have." His answers were economical, offering information without elaboration. Most people Clara knew filled silence with chatter, uncomfortable with gaps in conversation. Finn Crawford seemed perfectly at ease with quiet. She handed him a mug of coffee, and their fingers brushed briefly. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, something primal and unsettling. She pulled back quickly, retreating to her own chair. They sat in silence for several minutes, the storm raging outside while the fire crackled between them. Clara found herself studying him from beneath her lashes. His face had the kind of weathered beauty that came from years lived outdoors, lines earned from squinting at horizons, a nose that had been broken at least once, a jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. He looked like he belonged in those mountains, like he'd been formed from the same ancient stone. "You live here alone?" Finn asked suddenly, his eyes scanning the cottage with what seemed like professional assessment. Clara stiffened. Hear it. Came the judgment, the questions, the inevitable discovery of her status as Millbrook's favorite subject of pity and scorn. "Yes," she said simply, offering nothing more. Finn nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Good place for it. Private, peaceful." There was no judgment in his voice, no curiosity about why a woman her age lived alone. It was simply an observation, stated and released. Something in Clara's chest loosened slightly. "What about you?" she asked. "Why Phantom Ridge?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Finn took a long drink of his coffee before answering. "Army," he said finally. "Did 3 tours overseas. When I got back, I found I couldn't handle cities anymore. Too many people, too much noise. The mountains are quiet. They don't ask questions." There was a story buried in those few sentences. Clara could hear the weight of it in his voice. But unlike the people of Millbrook, who would have pressed for details and gossip, she simply nodded. "I understand," she said. And she did. Different reasons, perhaps, but the same essential truth. Sometimes the only way to survive was to retreat. The storm intensified. Wind howling around the cottage like something alive and angry. A massive crack sounded from outside, followed by a thunderous crash that shook the walls. "Tree came down," Finn said, moving to the window. "Big one from the sound of it." Clara joined him, peering out into the darkness. In the next flash of lightning, she saw it. A massive Douglas fir had fallen across her driveway, completely blocking the only road out. "We're trapped," she said, the reality settling over her. Until someone can clear that, nothing's getting through. Finn studied the fallen tree with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to solving problems. "I can cut it. I've got a chainsaw in my truck, assuming the truck's still where I left it. But not tonight. Too dangerous in this weather. Tomorrow, once the storm passes. Tomorrow." Which meant this stranger would be spending the night in her cottage. The old Clara, the one who still cared what Millbrook thought, would have panicked at the impropriety. But Clara was exhausted, worn down by years of trying to meet impossible standards. This Clara just felt tired. "I have a spare room," she said. "It's small, but the bed's decent." Finn turned to look at her, and for a moment, something passed between them, a mutual recognition of two people who'd learned to exist on the margins. He nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and respect. "I'll earn my keep," he said. "Whatever you need done around here, I can handle it." "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted gently. "It's how I operate. You're offering me shelter. I offer labor in return. That's fair trade." Fair trade. When was the last time someone had offered Clara anything that felt fair? The people of Millbrook took from her her peace, her dignity, her sense of self, and gave back only judgment and pity. "Okay," she agreed. "Thank you." They settled back into silence, but it felt different now, less awkward, more companionable. Clara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months, maybe years. There was something calming about Finn Crawford's presence, something solid and uncomplicated that, as the night deepened and the storm continued its assault, Clara showed Finn to the spare room and bid him good night. But sleep eluded her. She lay in her own bed, listening to the rain and thinking about the strange man sleeping down the hall. She didn't know yet that Finn Crawford would change everything. That his presence would force Millbrook to confront its cruelty. That he would look at her with eyes that saw not what she lacked, but what she possessed. All she knew was that for the first time in 3 years, she'd spent an evening without once thinking of herself as broken, and that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, might be the closest thing to a miracle she'd ever experienced. Clara woke to silence. After 3 days of relentless rain and wind, the absence of sound felt almost unnatural. Pale morning light filtered through her curtains, and for a disoriented moment, she forgot about the stranger sleeping down the hall. Then she heard it, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. She dressed quickly and stepped onto her front porch to find Finn already at work. He'd located her woodpile and was systematically cutting logs into manageable pieces, his movements efficient and practiced. His flannel shirt was draped over the porch railing, leaving him in just a worn t-shirt despite the October chill. Each swing of the axe revealed the controlled power in his frame. This wasn't someone who worked out in a gym. This was functional strength, built from necessity. Hemingway sat nearby, watching with fascination, his tail thumping against the wet ground. "Morning," Clara called out, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the cold. Finn turned, lowering the axe. His hair was still damp, probably from washing up with the hand pump by her garden. "Morning. Hope I didn't wake you. Figured you'd need wood, and I wanted to get started on that tree blocking your drive." Clara looked past him to where the massive Douglas fir lay like a fallen giant. In daylight, the scale of it was even more impressive, easily 3 feet in diameter, blocking the entire driveway and part of her yard. "That's going to take hours to clear," she said. "Most of the day, probably." Finn embedded the axe in the chopping block and reached for his shirt. "But I've handled worse. My truck's still in the ditch, half submerged. That'll have to wait for a tow, but at least I can get you mobile again." The casual assumption that he'd spend his entire day solving her problems felt foreign to Clara. Men she'd known in Millbrook helped with the expectation of gratitude performances, the kind that involved public acknowledgement and social debt. Finn spoke about the work like it was simply what needed to be done. "I'll make breakfast," Clara offered. "It's the least I can do. Already ate. Found some granola bars in my pack. But coffee would be appreciated if you're making some." Inside, Clara started the coffee and found herself moving around the kitchen with unusual awareness. She could see Finn through the window as he worked, and something about his presence made her cottage feel different, less like a hiding place, and more like an actual home. By mid-morning, she'd brought him coffee and sandwiches, which he accepted, with a simple nod of thanks before returning to work. He'd retrieved a chainsaw from his partially submerged truck. How he'd managed that, Clara couldn't imagine, and was methodically sectioning the fallen tree. She tried to work on her editing projects but found her attention constantly drawn to the window. There was something mesmerizing about watching Finn work, not just the physical aspect, though she'd be lying if she said that didn't register. It was the completeness of his focus, the way he moved through the world with intentional purpose. Around noon, a familiar truck appeared at the edge of her property where the fallen tree ended. Clara's stomach dropped when she recognized it. Thomas Brennan, Millbrook's volunteer fire chief and one of Margaret Holloway's most faithful congregants. Thomas climbed out, surveying the damage with his typical self-important air. His eyes landed on Finn, then swiveled to Clara's cottage with obvious speculation. Clara stepped outside, bracing herself. "Clara," Thomas called, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority he adopted whenever he thought someone needed his guidance. "We've been checking on folks after the storm. Heard you might have had a tree come down." "As you can see," Clara gestured to the obvious destruction. "But it's being handled." Thomas approached, his gaze fixed on Finn with suspicion. "And who might you be?" Finn straightened, setting down the chainsaw with deliberate care. He was several inches taller than Thomas and considerably broader. The contrast between Thomas's puffed-up posturing and Finn's quiet confidence was almost comical. "Finn Crawford," he said evenly. "My truck went into the ditch during the storm. Ms. Bennett was kind enough to offer shelter." The way Finn said Ms. Bennett, with natural respect rather than the condescending familiarity most Millbrook men used, sent a small thrill through Clara. Thomas's expression shifted through several calculations. Clara could practically see him composing the story he'd tell at the diner. "The Bennett woman had a strange man overnight, alone. You know what that means." "I see," Thomas said slowly. "Well, Clara, if you'd told someone you had company, we could have sent—" "I didn't have phone service," Clara interrupted, her voice sharper than intended. "The tower went down, remember? Still, having a strange man here, overnight, alone." Thomas let the implication hang in the air like smoke. Something in Clara snapped. Years of swallowing her dignity, of accepting judgment from people who'd never earned the right to judge her, of shrinking herself to fit into Millbrook's narrow definition of acceptability, all of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "Mr. Crawford needed help and I provided it," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The same way any decent person would. If you find that scandalous, Thomas, that says more about your mind than my actions." Thomas's face flushed red. He wasn't accustomed to Clara pushing back. "Now see here. I think Miss Bennett made herself clear." Finn's voice cut through, quiet but carrying an edge that made Thomas actually step back. "Was there something else you needed? Or are you just here to make insinuations?" The two men locked eyes, and Clara watched Thomas realize he was outmatched. Not just physically, but in some fundamental way that had nothing to do with size or strength. Finn Crawford possessed the kind of self-assurance that came from knowing exactly who he was, and not needing anyone's approval. Thomas couldn't comprehend that kind of freedom. "Fine," Thomas muttered. "I let Pastor Holloway know you managing. I'm sure he'll want to check on you himself." The threat was barely veiled. Pastor Richard Holloway was Margaret's husband and the moral authority of Millbrook. A visit from him was essentially a formal investigation into Clara's character. "He's welcome to visit," Clara said, surprised by her own calm. "During normal calling hours, with notice." Thomas retreated to his truck, firing one last look at Finn before driving off. As soon as he was gone, Clara's bravado crumbled. She sank onto the porch steps, her hands trembling. "You okay?" Finn asked, approaching with cautious concern. "I just made everything worse," Clara whispered. "By tomorrow, the entire town will know I had a man stay overnight. They already think I M. She couldn't finish the sentence. "Think." "You're what?" Clara looked up at him, at this stranger who'd somehow become caught in Millbrook's web of judgment. A cautionary tale. A warning to young girls about what happens when you're defective. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. Finn's expression darkened. "Defective," he repeated, his tone making it sound absurd. "That's what they say about you, among other things." Clara stood, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't have children. In a town like this, that makes me less than broken. Stop." Finn's voice was gentle but firm. "I don't know what those people have been telling you, but there's nothing broken about you. You don't understand. I understand plenty." He moved closer, and Clara caught the scent of pine and wood smoke clinging to him. "I understand small town cruelty. I understand people who measure worth by things that don't matter. And I understand that sometimes the people calling you broken are the ones who can't see past their own limitations." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. She'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone defend her without simultaneously pitying her. "Why do you care?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Finn was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. "Last night, when I knocked on your door, you were holding a fireplace poker. You were scared, probably smart to be scared. But you let me in anyway. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them. No questions, no judgment. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Something cracked open in Clara's chest, something that had been sealed shut for so long she'd forgotten it existed. "Thank you," she managed. Finn nodded once, then returned to his work on the tree. But something had shifted between them. Some invisible line had been crossed. The rest of the day passed in a strange kind of harmony. Clara brought Finn water and food at regular intervals. He took breaks to stack the wood he'd cut, organizing it with the same careful attention he applied to everything. They talked occasionally, brief exchanges about the weather, the mountains, small things that somehow felt significant. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Finn made the final cut on the last section of trunk. The driveway was clear, the wood stacked neatly, and Clara's property looked better than it had in months. "That should do it," Finn said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. "You're clear to drive out whenever you need." "I don't know how to thank you," Clara said. "You've done so much. You gave me shelter. This is fair trade, remember?" But there was something in his expression that suggested it had become more than that, at least for him. "Your truck," Clara said suddenly. "You'll need a tow." "I can drive you into town, help you arrange. No need. I've got a buddy who runs a recovery service in Pinewood. I'll call him once I hike back to where there's cell service. That's a 15-mile hike back to Phantom Ridge." Finn shrugged. "I've walked farther." Clara made a decision then, one that surprised her even as she spoke. "Stay tonight. One more night. The spare room is already made up, and it's getting dark. You can call your friend in the morning when the roads are safer." She expected him to refuse. Men like Finn Crawford seemed allergic to accepting help. But he studied her with those storm cloud eyes and slowly nodded. "All right," he said. "One more night." That evening, Clara cooked dinner, real dinner, not the perfunctory meals she usually made for herself. She found herself wanting to cook for him, to create something warm and substantial. They ate together at her small kitchen table, and the conversation flowed easier now. Finn told her about Phantom Ridge, about the cabin he'd built himself over 2 years, about the hawks that nested near his property, and the elk that came down from the high country in winter. He spoke about the mountains, the way other people spoke about family, with deep affection and respect. Clara found herself talking about her editing work, about the manuscripts that made her laugh or cry, about the strange intimacy of helping shape someone else's words. She told him about her grandmother, about inheriting this cottage, and the freedom it had represented before Millbrook had turned it into exile. She didn't mention the diagnosis, the medical details, the years of hope, slowly calcifying into resignation. That conversation felt too heavy for this fragile newness between them. "You ever think about leaving?" Finn asked as they cleaned up the dishes. "Going somewhere else, starting over where nobody knows your history?" Clara had thought about it countless times. "Where would I go? And what difference would it make?" "I'd still be me. That's not a bad thing to be." The simplicity of his statement hit her harder than any elaborate compliment could have. Finn Crawford didn't deal in flattery or empty reassurances. When he said something, he meant it. Later, as they sat by the fire with Hemingway stretched between them, Clara asked the question that had been building all day. "Why did you really leave the army?" Finn was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of things that couldn't be unsaid. "I was good at what I did. Too good, maybe. Third tour, we were in a village." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I followed orders, did what I was trained to do. But when I got home and tried to sleep, all I could see were the faces of people who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time." He turned to look at her, and Clara saw genuine pain in his eyes. "The nightmares got bad. Real bad. PTSD, the doctors called it, like naming it would make it smaller. I tried medication, therapy, group sessions. Nothing worked until I moved to the ridge. Up there, alone with just the mountains and the quiet, I could finally breathe again." "Do you still have nightmares?" Clara asked softly. "Sometimes. But less. The silence helps. And knowing I'm not hurting anyone anymore." He paused. "People in Pinewood think I'm strange, living alone up there. They probably have theories about what's wrong with me. Let me guess, they think you're broken?" Finn's mouth curved into something that almost resembled a smile. "Yeah, funny how people love that word. Makes them feel whole, I guess, having someone to look down on." They sat in silence, two people who'd been labeled and dismissed finding unexpected understanding in each other's company. The fire crackled, Hemingway snored gently, and outside, the night was clear and full of stars that Millbrook's judgment couldn't reach. "Thank you for staying," Clara said eventually. "For not leaving right away." Finn met her eyes, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Thank you for letting me." Neither of them acknowledged what was happening between them, the pull, the recognition, the sense that something significant was beginning. It was too new, too fragile to name, but as Clara lay in bed that night, listening to the house settle around her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: possibility. Not certainty, not promise, just the faint whisper that maybe her story wasn't finished being written, and maybe, just maybe, the best chapters were still ahead. Tomorrow Finn would leave, would hike back to his mountain and his solitude, and Clara would return to her life in Millbrook's shadow. But tonight, in this moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where being herself was enough, one where someone looked at her and saw not what she lacked, but everything she was. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, and somewhere in the darkness, Clara Bennett smiled. The town meeting happened 3 days after Finn left. Clara had driven him to Pinewood that morning to arrange the truck recovery, and they'd stood in the parking lot of the tow company. With an awkwardness that betrayed how much had changed in 48 hours. Finn had written his phone number on a scrap of paper, in case you need anything, and Clara had clutched it like a lifeline as she watched him disappear into the mountains. She'd expected the loneliness to return with his absence. Instead, she felt something else, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Like Finn had left behind some of his mountain solidity, and it had taken root in her. But Millbrook wasn't done with her yet. The summons came via handwritten note, delivered by Pastor Richard Holloway himself. He'd appeared at her door Thursday afternoon with the solemn expression he reserved for serious spiritual matters. "Clara, the church council would like to speak with you," he'd said, his voice grave. "Sunday afternoon, after services. There are concerns that need to be addressed." What concerns? Clara had asked, though she already knew. "Concerns about your conduct. About the example you're setting for the young women of this community." He'd paused, his eyes softening with manufactured sympathy. "We only want to help you, Clara, to guide you back to a righteous path." She could have refused, could have told him exactly what he could do with his guidance. But something made her agree, maybe curiosity about how far Millbrook would go, or maybe the simple fact that she was tired of running from their judgment. "I'll be there," she'd said now. Standing outside the church's fellowship hall on a gray Sunday afternoon, Clara felt her newfound strength waver. Through the windows she could see them assembled like a tribunal. Pastor Holloway at the head of the table, Margaret beside him with her pursed-lip righteousness, Thomas Brennan looking vindicated, and 4 other council members whose faces wore varying degrees of concern and condemnation. Clara's hand went to her pocket, where Finn's number rested like a talisman. She'd almost called him a dozen times over the past 3 days, but hadn't trusted herself to explain what his presence had meant. How do you tell someone they'd made you feel human again? She pushed open the door. 7 pairs of eyes turned to her with synchronized judgment. The room smelled of coffee and old hymnals, and Clara suddenly felt like she was back in high school, called to the principal's office for crimes she hadn't committed. "Thank you for coming, Clara," Pastor Holloway began, gesturing to the single chair facing the council table. The symbolism wasn't subtle, them elevated, her below, and accused facing her accusers. Clara sat, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "We've asked you here today because we care about you," Margaret started, her voice dripping with false concern. "As members of this community, as Christians, we have a responsibility to address behaviors that concern us." "What behaviors?" Clara asked, keeping her voice level. Thomas leaned forward eagerly. "You had a strange man staying in your home, overnight, without a chaperone, without propriety. Do you understand how that appears?" "It appears that I helped someone who needed shelter during a dangerous storm," Clara replied. "The same thing Jesus would have done, I imagine." Margaret's lips thinned. "Don't be flippant. This isn't about basic charity. This is about a pattern of behavior that suggests a woman without proper moral guidance." "A pattern?" Clara felt anger beginning to burn through her fear. "What pattern?" Pastor Holloway shuffled some papers before him, and Clara realized with dawning horror that they'd prepared documentation. This wasn't a conversation, it was a prosecution. "You've rejected multiple courtship opportunities from upstanding men in this community," he read from his notes. "You've isolated yourself from fellowship. You refuse to attend women's Bible study. You've made no effort to involve yourself in church activities appropriate for single women. And now this incident with the stranger. His name is Finn Crawford. Clara interrupted. And he's not a stranger. He's a veteran who served our country and lives peacefully on Phantom Ridge. Living alone in the wilderness, no church affiliation, no community ties. Margaret recited like she was reading from a list of sins. And you welcomed this man into your home without thinking of your reputation or the example you set. What example? Clara's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. That women should let people freeze to death rather than risk gossip. That women should conduct themselves with dignity and awareness of their position, Pastor Holloway said firmly. Clara, you're not getting any younger. You're unmarried, without children, without the natural fulfillment that God intends for women. We understand that must be difficult. Do you? Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Do you understand what it's like to be treated like a failure because your body won't cooperate with your town's expectations? The room went silent. Clara had never pushed back like this before, had never given voice to the anger that had been building for years. We understand that you're struggling, Margaret said carefully. That's why we want to help you. There are support groups for women dealing with your condition. And there are ways you can still contribute meaningfully to our community. My condition? Clara laughed, and it sounded harsh even to her own ears. Say it, Margaret. Say what you all whisper behind my back. Barren. That's the word you use, isn't it? The council members shifted uncomfortably. Even they seemed to recognize that something had shifted, that the Clara who'd absorbed their judgment for years wasn't in the room anymore. Clara, please sit down, Pastor Holloway said, his pastoral voice returning. We're not here to hurt you. We're here because we're worried about your soul. My soul is fine, Clara said, but she sat anyway, exhausted by the surge of emotion. What you're worried about is your control. You're worried that I'm not following your script for what a woman should be. God's script, Margaret corrected sharply. Be fruitful and multiply. It's not our invention, it's biblical mandate. And when a woman rejects that mandate, when she lives in defiance of her natural purpose, I haven't rejected anything. The words burst out of Clara with years of pent-up pain. I didn't choose this. I would give anything to have children, to be normal by your standards, but I can't. And you've taken that tragedy and turned it into a character judgment. You've made my medical condition into a moral failing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara could see some of the council members looking uncertain now, as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time, but not Margaret. Margaret's face had hardened into righteous certainty. If you truly wanted children, you would have accepted James Mitchell's proposal, she said coldly. He was willing to overlook your limitations, willing to adopt, to give you the opportunity, to be a mother despite your deficiencies. But you rejected him, just like you rejected Paul Winters and David Chun before him. You've had opportunities, Clara, and you've thrown them away. That's not tragedy, that's pride. Clara stared at her, stunned by the cruelty masquerading as concern. James Mitchell had proposed to her 2 years ago, had told her over dinner that he was willing to settle for adoption since she couldn't give him real children. He'd presented marriage as a favor he was doing her, a charitable act that would save her from loneliness. She'd turned him down because she'd realized, sitting across from him in that restaurant, that she'd rather be alone forever than spend her life with someone who saw her as a project to fix. James didn't want me, Clara said quietly. He wanted a housekeeper who'd be grateful for his pity, just like Paul wanted someone to care for his aging mother, and David wanted someone who'd fit into his 5-year plan without causing complications. None of them saw me as a person, Margaret. They saw a problem with a solution. And what does this mountain man see? Thomas interjected with a sneer. Another lonely woman who'll be grateful for attention. The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow. Was that what Finn saw? Had she been so desperate for kindness that she'd misread basic human decency for something more? I don't know what Finn sees, Clara admitted. But I know what he doesn't see. He doesn't see broken. He doesn't see failure. He doesn't see someone who needs to be fixed or saved or pitied. He sees opportunity, Margaret said bluntly. A vulnerable woman, isolated, desperate. Clara, we're trying to protect you from making a terrible mistake. The only mistake I've made is staying in this town as long as I have, Clara said, the realization crystallizing even as she spoke. You've all convinced yourselves you're concerned for my well-being, but what you really want is conformity. You want me to accept my place at the bottom of your social hierarchy and be grateful for whatever scraps of approval you throw my way. Pastor Holloway stood, his face flushed. Clara Bennett, you are dangerously close to blasphemy. We have offered you guidance, fellowship, and support. If you reject these offerings, if you persist in this rebellious attitude, then we'll have no choice but to inform the congregation that you've removed yourself from this community's spiritual protection. It was a threat, and they all knew it. In Millbrook, being cast out by the church meant being cast out by the town. It meant losing the few social connections she still maintained, becoming even more isolated, being marked officially as someone to avoid. Clara should have been terrified. Instead, she felt strangely liberated. Then I guess you'll have to do what you feel is necessary, she said, standing to face them. Because I'm done apologizing for not fitting into your narrow definition of worthiness. I'm done accepting judgment from people who've never bothered to know me, and I'm done pretending that your approval matters more than my own self-respect. She walked toward the door, but Margaret's voice stopped her. You're making a mistake, Clara. That man, that stranger, he's going to use you and leave you, and then you'll have nothing. No church, no community, no chance at redemption. Is that really what you want? Clara turned back, and for the first time in years, she felt absolutely certain of her answer. What I want is to stop letting my worth be determined by people who've never valued me anyway. What I want is to stop measuring my life by what I don't have instead of what I do. And what I want is for all of you to understand that your concern isn't kindness, it's control. She left then, walking out into the October afternoon with her head high and her heart hammering. She just burned every bridge she had left in. Millbrook had officially made herself an outcast in the only home she'd ever known. But as she climbed into her car, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. Her phone rang as she started the engine. Unknown number. Hello? Clara? It's Finn. His voice, rough and familiar, sent warmth flooding through her. I hope it's okay I'm calling. I've been thinking about you. Wanted to make sure you're doing all right. Clara surprised herself by laughing, though it came out slightly hysterical. I just got excommunicated from my church. Well, not officially, but it's coming. Silence on the other end. Then, what happened? And Clara found herself telling him everything. The council meeting. Clara found herself telling him everything. Accusations, Margaret's cruelty, her own explosive honesty. Words poured out of her in a torrent. 3 years of suppressed anger and pain finally finding release. Finn listened without interrupting, and when she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. I'm proud of you, he said finally. Clara. Hadn't expected that. For what? For destroying what little social standing I had left. For standing up for yourself. For refusing to shrink. That takes more courage than most people ever show. He paused. Listen, I know this is fast and maybe I'm overstepping, but you could come up here, to the ridge. Just for a few days to get away from it all. I have plenty of space, and the mountains have a way of putting things in perspective. Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She barely knew him. Running away to a stranger's cabin in the wilderness was impulsive, and potentially dangerous and completely unlike her. But then again, the old Clara had followed all the rules, and it had gotten her nowhere but miserable. Okay, she heard herself. Say, I'll come. She could hear the smile in Finn's voice. Yeah? Yeah, I just need to pack some things. Arrange for someone to watch Hemingway. Bring the dog, Finn interrupted. There's plenty of room for both of you. After they hung up, Clara sat in her car for a long moment, processing what she'd just agreed to. She was going to spend several days alone in the mountains with a man she'd known for less than a week. Millbrook would have a field day with it, but Millbrook had already decided who she was. Maybe it was time she decided for herself. Clara drove home, her mind already planning. She'd need warm clothes, her laptop for work, supplies for Hemingway. She'd need to be smart about this, practical. But underneath the practical considerations, something else bloomed: anticipation. For the first time in years, Clara Bennett was choosing something for herself, not because it was safe or acceptable, or calculated to win approval, but simply because it felt right. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone buzzed with a text. Margaret Holloway, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. Don't say we didn't warn you. Clara deleted it without responding. Whatever happened next, it would be her choice. Her mistake to make, if it was a mistake. Her joy to claim, if it was joy. And after years of living by other people's rules, that freedom was worth any price. She started packing, and as she did, Clara caught herself humming something she hadn't done since before the diagnosis, before Millbrook had taught her that women like her weren't entitled to happiness. But maybe they'd been wrong about that. Maybe happiness wasn't something you earned by meeting impossible standards. Maybe it was something you claimed by refusing to live any other way. The mountains were waiting, and so was Finn Crawford. Clara Bennett was done waiting for permission to live her life. She was going to the ridge. The road to Phantom Ridge was barely a road at all. Clara's sedan bounced over ruts and rocks, climbing steadily through Douglas fir forests that grew thicker with each mile. Hemingway stood with his front paws on the passenger seat, nose pressed against the window, tail wagging at every deer that bounded across their path. Finn had texted her detailed directions, warning her that the last 3 miles were rough. He hadn't been kidding. Twice Clara wondered if her car would make it, but something drove her forward: stubborn determination or reckless hope. She couldn't tell which. After 90 minutes of climbing, the forest suddenly opened up. Clara caught her breath. Phantom Ridge stretched before her like something out of a painting. A high alpine meadow surrounded by peaks that pierced the sky. Late afternoon sun painted everything gold, and she could see for what felt like forever. No houses, no power lines, no evidence of civilization except the narrow track she'd been following. And there, at the edge of the meadow where the forest began again, stood a cabin. It was larger than she'd expected, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to silver gray. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and a covered porch wrapped around the front. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, and she could see a greenhouse attached to one side. Finn emerged as she pulled up, and Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. He wore the same practical clothes, flannel and denim, but up here, in his element, he looked different. More relaxed, more complete. Like he'd been holding himself carefully in check in her cottage and could finally breathe freely. "You made it," he said, opening her car door with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Your directions were good." Clara climbed out, stretching muscles stiff from the drive. Hemingway bounded past her, immediately beginning an intensive investigation of the new territory. "Come on. I'll show you around before the sun sets." Finn grabbed her bags from the trunk like they weighed nothing. "Fair warning, it's rustic up here. No internet. Cell service is spotty at best, and the power's all solar. I've got a generator for emergencies, but mostly I make do." "It's perfect," Clara said, and meant it. The cabin's interior was a revelation. She'd expected sparse bachelor quarters, a cot, maybe a camping stove, the bare minimum. Instead, she found a home. The main room had exposed beam ceilings and wide plank floors, worn smooth by use. A river-stone fireplace dominated one wall, already crackling with warmth. The furniture was simple but clearly handcrafted as sturdy. Couch with thick cushions, chairs built for comfort, bookshelves lining every available wall. The kitchen was compact but functional, with a propane stove and a deep farmhouse sink. But it was the details that caught Clara's attention. Hand-woven rugs on the floor, photographs of mountain landscapes on the walls, a guitar resting in the corner, jars of preserved vegetables lined up on shelves. This wasn't survival. This was a life deliberately chosen and carefully built. I know it's not much, Finn started. It's beautiful, Clara interrupted. You built all this yourself? He nodded, looking almost embarrassed. Took 2 years. I lived in a tent the first summer while I was laying the foundation. Nearly froze the first winter before I got the walls up. He gestured down a short hallway. Guest rooms that way. It's small, but there's a real bed and a wood stove. Bathroom's got running water. I've got a spring-fed system with a cistern. It's cold, but it works. Clara followed him to the guest room, which was indeed small but felt cozy rather than cramped. A handmade quilt covered the bed, and a window looked out over the meadow toward the peaks beyond. She could already imagine waking up to that view. This is more than I expected, she admitted. Finn leaned against the doorframe, and Clara noticed he maintained careful distance, as if aware of the intimacy of being alone together in such isolation. Most people hear off-grid mountain cabin and picture some survivalist shack. But I'm not hiding from civilization, Clara. I'm just choosing a different kind of life. Why this place? She asked. Why Phantom Ridge specifically? Found it by accident my first year back from deployment. I was hiking, trying to outrun the nightmares, and I came over that rise and saw ... He gestured toward the window. This. And something in me just settled. Like I'd been looking for something without knowing what, and here it was. Clara understood that feeling more than she could express. The sense of pieces falling into place, of finding where you fit when everywhere else felt wrong. They made dinner together, venison stew that Finn had prepared earlier, served with bread he'd baked himself. Clara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years, moving around his kitchen like they'd done this 100 times before. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences. Tell me about your work, Finn said as they ate at the rough wooden table. What kind of manuscripts do you edit? Clara found herself opening up about her clients, the debut novelist whose raw talent needed shaping, the memoirist trying to make sense of trauma, the poet whose words could break your heart. She talked about the satisfaction of helping people find their voice, of being the invisible hand that made their vision clearer. It sounds lonely, though, Finn observed. All that time alone with other people's stories. Says the man who lives alone on a mountain, Clara countered with a smile. Fair point, he grinned. I guess we're both professional hermits. At least you have a good excuse. I'm just antisocial. You're not antisocial, Finn said seriously. You've been hurt by people who should have protected you. There's a difference between choosing solitude and being driven to it. His insight cut close to the bone. Clara set down her spoon, suddenly finding it hard to meet his eyes. Can I ask you something? She said quietly. At my cottage you said I wasn't broken. Did you mean that, or were you just being kind? Finn was silent for a long moment, and when Clara finally looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I meant it, he said. Clara, I've seen broken. I've been broken, and you're not it. You're someone who's been told a lie so many times you started believing it. But that doesn't make it true. The doctors told you about your body, not your worth. Those are different things. He leaned forward, his gray eyes holding hers. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who opened her door to a stranger in a storm. Someone who stood up to a whole town's judgment even, though it terrified her. Someone who drove 3 hours up a mountain because she was brave enough to choose something different. That's not broken, Clara. That's strong as hell. Tears burned behind Clara's eyes. She'd spent so long viewing herself through Millbrook's lens that hearing someone describe her with respect, with admiration, even felt foreign and overwhelming. "I don't feel strong," she admitted. "Strength isn't a feeling. It's a choice you make when everything in you wants to give up." Finn reached across the table and after a moment's hesitation took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, and the contact sent electricity up her arm. "You've been making that choice every day, even if you didn't realize it." Clara looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curled around hers with careful gentleness. 3 weeks ago, she'd been convinced she'd spend the rest of her life alone, that no one would ever want her as she was. Now she sat in a mountain cabin with a man who looked at her like she mattered, like her presence was something valuable rather than something to tolerate. "Thank you," she whispered, "for inviting me here, for giving me a place to breathe. You can stay as long as you need," Finn said. "Days, weeks, whatever helps. No pressure, no expectations. Just space." After dinner, they moved to the couch near the fire. Hemingway sprawled across both their laps, shameless in his comfort. Finn told her about the ridge, the black bears that occasionally wandered through, the mountain lions he heard but rarely saw, the harsh winters that could isolate him for weeks at a time. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Clara asked. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But it's a different kind of lonely than being surrounded by people who don't understand you. At least here, the loneliness is honest." Clara understood exactly what he meant. As the fire burned low, Finn picked up the guitar from the corner. "I should warn you, I'm not very good," he said. But his fingers moved over the strings with practiced ease. He played simple melodies, folk songs, and half-remembered tunes that filled the cabin with warmth. Clara closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, feeling tension she'd carried for years begin to unwind. When he started singing softly, a ballad about mountains and home, his voice was rough but genuine, and something in Clara's chest cracked open wider. "That was beautiful," she said when he finished. "My mom taught me. Before she died, she used to say music was prayer in a different language." He set the guitar aside carefully. "I don't know if I believe that, but up here, playing helps, makes the silence feel less empty." "How long has she been gone?" 12 years, cancer." Finn stared into the fire. "She's the one who would have understood this place. She grew up in Montana, always talked about getting back to the mountains someday. Never got the chance." "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it. "Me too." He was quiet for a moment. "But I like to think she'd approve of the cabin. She'd probably tell me the greenhouse should be bigger and I need better curtains, but she'd understand why I'm here." Clara thought about her own grandmother, the only person who'd ever made her feel unconditionally accepted. "My grandmother used to say that home wasn't about buildings or towns. It was about finding the place where you could be fully yourself without apology." Smart woman, she was. She died before everything fell apart, before Millbrook decided I was defective. Sometimes I'm grateful she didn't have to see what I became. Finn turned to face her fully. "Clara, listen to me. You didn't become anything. You survived a situation that would have crushed most people. You kept your humanity in a place that tried to take it from you. Your grandmother would be proud as hell." The certainty in his voice broke something loose in Clara, the tears she'd been holding back since. The church council meeting finally spilled over, and suddenly she was crying, really crying. Not the careful, silent tears she'd taught herself to shed. These were ugly, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded. Finn pulled her against his chest without hesitation, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other rubbed circles on her back. He didn't try to shush her or tell her it would be okay. He just held her while years of accumulated pain poured out. When the storm finally passed, Clara found herself curled against him, exhausted, but somehow lighter. She could hear his heartbeat, steady beneath her ear, feel the rise and fall of his breathing. "Sorry," she mumbled into his shirt. "I didn't mean to fall apart on you." "Don't apologize. Sometimes falling apart is the bravest thing you can do." His voice rumbled in his chest. "And for what it's worth, I don't think you fell apart. I think you finally let yourself feel what you've been holding back." Clara pulled back enough to look up at him. His face was close, his eyes soft with concern, and she became acutely aware of how they were tangled together, how his arms still circled her, how easy it would be to close the small distance between them. She saw the moment he registered it too, the way his breathing changed, the way his gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. Tension hummed between them, electric and uncertain. "Clara," he said softly, and it sounded like both question and warning. She should pull away. They'd known each other less than 2 weeks. This was too fast, too intense, too potentially catastrophic if it went wrong. Every rational thought screamed caution, but Clara was tired of listening to rational thoughts that kept her small and safe and alone. She kissed him. It was tentative at first, testing, giving him every chance to pull away. But Finn made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, his hand coming up to cup her face with devastating gentleness. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was chosen, like she was exactly what he wanted. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Finn rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since you handed me that first cup of coffee," he admitted. Clara laughed shakily. "I've been wanting it since you told Thomas Brennan to back off." "That obvious, huh?" "Extremely." Clara pulled back far enough to see his face properly. "Finn, I need you to know, I'm not looking for someone to fix me or save me. I'm not a project or a charity case. If we're doing this, whatever this is, I need it to be real." "Clara." He traced her cheekbone with his thumb, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "I don't want to fix you because there's nothing to fix. I don't want to save you because you're perfectly capable of saving yourself. What I want," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "what I want is to know you, really know you. And maybe, if you'll let me, I want to see where this goes." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. No promises of forever, no grand declarations, just simple, genuine interest in who she was. "I'd like that," Clara whispered. They stayed on the couch long into the night, talking and kissing and discovering each other in the firelight. Finn told her about the cabin's construction, about nearly dying in a blizzard his first winter, about learning to live with his demons. Clara told him about her editing work, about the grandmother who'd loved her unconditionally, about the small joys she'd built her life around. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them. Finn walked Clara to the guest room, kissed her goodnight with a sweetness that made her ache, and left her alone with her thoughts. Clara lay in the darkness, listening to the silence of the mountain, so different from the oppressive quiet of her cottage in Millbrook. Up here, silence felt like possibility rather than judgment. She didn't know what would happen when she returned to town. Didn't know if what was starting between her and Finn could survive the real world's complications. Didn't know if she was being brave or foolish or some combination of both. But for the first time in years, Clara Bennett felt like herself again, not the broken thing Millbrook had named her. Not the cautionary tale or the barren curse. Just Clara, whole and imperfect and deserving of happiness. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Clara woke to golden light streaming through the window, and the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway. For a disoriented moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory flooded back, the cabin, the mountains, Finn's kiss, and warmth spread through her chest. She dressed quickly and followed the scent to the kitchen, where Finn stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the concentration of someone performing surgery. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile that made her stomach flip. "Hope you're hungry. I tend to overcook when I have company." The table was already set with mismatched plates, fresh butter, and what looked like homemade berry syrup. Hemingway lay beneath it, clearly hoping for dropped food. "You didn't have to do all this," Clara said, sliding into a chair. "Wanted to." Finn brought over a stack of pancakes that could have fed a small army. "Besides, I figured after yesterday's drama, you deserved a good breakfast." They ate together in comfortable silence, and Clara marveled at how natural this felt. No awkwardness after the previous night's intensity, no regret or second-guessing. Just easy companionship and pancakes that tasted better than anything she'd made herself in months. "I want to show you something," Finn said after they'd cleaned up. "If you're up for a hike." "How far?" "About 2 miles. There's a place I go when I need to think. Figured you might appreciate it." They set out into crisp morning air, Hemingway bounding ahead on the trail. Finn moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who'd walked these paths 1,000 times, pointing out animal tracks and edible plants as they climbed. Clara found herself studying him as much as the scenery, the way he moved, the quiet competence in everything he did. The trail switchbacked up through old-growth forest before breaking out onto a rocky promontory. Clara gasped. They stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. Mountains marched away in every direction, their peaks still dusted with early snow. A hawk circled far below them, riding thermals up from the valley floor. "I come here when the cabin feels too small," Finn said, settling onto a flat rock. "Helps me remember how big the world actually is." Clara sat beside him, overwhelmed by the scale of it all. From up here, Millbrook's judgment seemed microscopic, a tiny, petty thing compared to this ancient landscape's indifference. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "To the ridge, I mean. Not just this spot. Thank you for coming." Finn picked up a pebble, turning it over in his fingers. "I wasn't sure you would. After I invited you, I kept thinking maybe I'd overstepped. We barely know each other." "We know the important things," Clara countered. "The stuff that matters." "Do we?" He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Clara, last night it was amazing. But I need you to understand what you'd be getting into with me. The nightmares I mentioned, they're not occasional. Some nights I wake up thinking I'm back in Kandahar, and it takes me hours to remember where I am. I don't do crowds. I can barely handle going into Pinewood once a month. And I'm never leaving this ridge. This is my home, my healing place. I'm not interested in compromise or trying to split my time between here and civilization." Clara appreciated his honesty even as her heart sank slightly. "You're saying you're not the white knight who rides in to save the damsel and take her away from her problems. I'm saying I'm a man with his own problems who lives on a mountain and has no interest in being anyone's solution." He met her eyes steadily. "But I'm also saying that I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time, and I want to see where this goes. As long as you know what you're signing up for." "What am I signing up for?" "Someone who's figuring his life out one day at a time. Someone who can't promise you fancy dates or social events, or any of the normal relationship things. Someone who might wake you up at 3 in the morning having a panic attack." He paused. "Someone who thinks you're extraordinary exactly as you are and doesn't need you to be anything different." Clara's throat tightened. "Can I tell you what I'm signing up for? Someone who's been told her entire worth depends on something her body can't do. Someone who's bitter and angry and still learning how to believe she deserves good things. Someone who doesn't know if she can ever go back to Millbrook or if she even wants to." She reached for his hand. "Someone who thinks you're pretty extraordinary too." Finn laced his fingers through hers. "We're a mess, aren't we?" "The best kind of mess." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, staring out at the endless mountains. "Finn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." Okay. Does it bother you that I can't have children? She felt him tense slightly, and her stomach dropped. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. It doesn't bother me because I don't want kids, Clara. Never have. He shifted to face her more fully. I know that probably makes me selfish or broken in some people's eyes, but I've known since I was young that fatherhood wasn't for me. After the war, I became even more certain. I can barely take care of myself some days. The idea of being responsible for a child, double quotes, he shook his head. That's not my path. Clara stared at him, processing. You're serious, completely. If you want kids, adoption or fostering or whatever, that's a deal breaker for me. I won't pretend otherwise. His gray eyes searched hers. Is that a problem? A laugh bubbled up from Clara's chest, slightly hysterical. A problem? Finn, do you have any idea how many men have rejected me because I couldn't give them children? And you're telling me you don't want them? Never have, never will. So all this time I've been grieving something that actually makes us more compatible? Looks that way. A smile tugged at his mouth. Life's funny like that. Clara kissed him. Then, hard and grateful, pouring years of pent-up relief into the contact. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she was crying and laughing simultaneously. I've been carrying this like a curse, she said through tears. Like I was defective because I couldn't be what everyone expected. And you're telling me you see it as just a fact, not a flaw. It's part of who you are, Clara, like my PTSD is part of who I am. Neither of us is broken. We're just not built for the life other people think we should want. He wiped her tears with his thumb. And, personally, I think that makes us pretty damn lucky. We get to build something different. They stayed on the promontory for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Finn told her about his plans to expand the greenhouse, about the chickens he wanted to raise come spring. Clara described the manuscript she was currently editing, a memoir about a woman who'd hiked the Appalachian Trail alone at 65. You should write your own story, Finn suggested. You've got one worth telling. Who'd want to read about a bitter woman and her small-town tormentors? I would. And I bet thousands of other people would too. People who've been told they're not enough because they don't fit the mold. He squeezed her hand. Your story isn't over, Clara. Maybe it's just beginning. The thought lodged in her chest like a seed finding fertile ground. They hiked back as afternoon shadows lengthened. Hemingway, trotting contentedly between them. Back at the cabin, they fell into an easy rhythm, Finn chopping vegetables for dinner, while Clara worked on her laptop at the kitchen table, both existing comfortably in the same space without needing to fill every silence. That night, after another simple meal shared by firelight, Finn taught Clara how to split kindling properly. She was terrible at it, her aim consistently off, but he stood behind her with patient encouragement, his hands over hers showing the right angle and force. Like this, he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. It's about precision, not strength. The wood split clean, and Clara felt absurdly proud. I did it. You're a natural. Finn's arms were still around her, and she turned in his embrace to find him looking at her with an expression that made her pulse race. Thank you, she said softly, for making me feel capable instead of helpless. You've always been capable, Clara. You just needed space to remember. They kissed again, slower this time, learning each other's rhythms. When they finally pulled apart, Finn's eyes had darkened. I should probably say goodnight, he said, his voice rough. Before I forget how to be a gentleman. What if I don't want you to be a gentleman? Heat flared in his gaze. Clara, I'm not asking for promises or commitments, she interrupted. I'm just saying that I'm a grown woman who knows what she wants. And I want you. But they were learning to hold each other's broken pieces with care. Learning that love wasn't about being fixed, but about being seen. That evening, As they sat on the porch watching stars emerge, Finn pulled something from his pocket. "I made you something," he said, sounding almost nervous. "It's not fancy, but—" He opened his palm to reveal a small wooden carving, a bird in flight, wings spread wide, every feather detailed with painstaking care. "Finn," Clara breathed, taking it carefully. "This is beautiful. It's a hawk, like the ones we saw from the overlook." He rubbed the back of his neck self-consciously. "I've been working on it for weeks. Wanted to give you something to mark ... I don't know, your freedom, I guess. Your choice to fly." Clara turned the carving over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. Then she looked up at this man who'd somehow become her entire world, who'd taken her brokenness and called it strength, who'd offered her a life without apology or compromise. "I love you," she said. The words felt momentous and simple all at once. "I know we haven't said it yet, but I love you, Finn Crawford. Not because you saved me or fixed me, but because you saw me, really saw me, and decided I was worth knowing." Finn's eyes went bright. He cupped her face in his calloused hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "Clara Bennett," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The town called you a curse. Called you broken and barren and less than. But they were wrong about everything." He leaned his forehead against hers. "You're not a curse. You're the only blessing I'll ever need. You're whole and strong and exactly enough. And I love you more than I thought I was capable of loving anything." The words shattered something in Clara, the last vestiges of shame, the final whispers of doubt. She kissed him with everything she had, pouring years of pain and new joy and fierce gratitude into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both were crying and laughing simultaneously. "We're ridiculous," Clara said through tears. "We're perfect," Finn countered. "Two broken people who found each other and realized we fit together just right." They sat together as full dark descended, wrapped in blankets and each other, watching the universe wheel overhead. Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the years of pain, the cruel judgment, the slow erosion of self-worth. She thought about the storm that had brought Finn to her door, about the courage it had taken to choose something different. She thought about Millbrook calling her barren, using it like a weapon, like proof of her failure, and she realized they'd been right about one thing: she was barren. Her body couldn't create life in the way they'd expected, but her life was anything but barren now. She had mountains that touched the sky. She had a man who loved her unconditionally. She had work that fulfilled her and silence that healed her, and a dog who thought she hung the moon. She had freedom and choice and the radical gift of being exactly who she was. "What are you thinking about?" Finn asked, pulling her closer against the cold. "That they called me a curse," Clara said softly. "And I believed them for so long. But curses don't feel like this." "Like what?" "Like a blessing. Like grace. Like coming home to myself after years of being lost." Finn kissed her temple. "You were never lost, Clara. Just temporarily misplaced. All you needed was the right map. And you were my map?" "Nah, you were always your own map. I just helped you remember how to read it." They stayed outside until the cold drove them in, then made love by firelight, with the kind of presence that comes from knowing you've found something rare. Afterward, Clara lay in Finn's arms, tracing the compass tattoo on his forearm. "Where does this point?" she asked drowsily. "Wherever home is," Finn murmured, already half asleep. "Used to think home was a place. Now I know it's a person." Clara smiled into the darkness, the wooden hawk clutched in her hand like a promise. She'd been called barren by a town that measured worth in pregnancies and conformity. She'd been labeled a curse by people who couldn't imagine value outside their narrow vision. But Finn Crawford damaged, difficult, beautiful Finn had looked at her and seen blessing. Had seen strength in her survival and grace in her imperfection. Had offered her not salvation but partnership, not rescue but recognition. and in accepting his love, in choosing this mountain life, in refusing to shrink herself anymore, Clara had found something Millbrook could never give her, the profound, radical blessing of being enough exactly as she was. The town had called her barren, but standing on this mountain, wrapped in the arms of a man who loved her without condition, surrounded by the vast wilderness that asked nothing of her but presence, Clara Bennett had never felt more abundant in her entire life. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was the only blessing that mattered, the only blessing she'd ever need. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.